Hi, I'm Justin Timmer. I'm a family lawyer at Conditsis Lawyers, and I'm joined today by Marguerite Schultz. She's a clinical psychologist from Living Well Psychology at Erina. Marguerite works with a team of 5 psychologists and has a relationship with our office. We often rely on her for support and some guidance when we deal with clients who are quite understandably having some emotional angst following separation. Thank you for joining us, Marguerite.
That's a pleasure. Thank you so much for having me, Justin.
Today we're going to be discussing the COVID-19 virus and the impact that that's having on Australian families. And there's some statistics which I'll take you to which indicate the prevalence of that impact. Marguerite, you may or may not have read already that there's been a significant increase in the applications which have been made before the family courts. It appears as though there's 2 primary driving reasons that there's been such a significant increase in applications. The first of those is, unfortunately, an increase of incidents of family violence in relationships, given that couples are locked down and spending a lot more time with one another than they might ordinarily spend with one another. And the second stream of those applications, if you like, is a result of people not complying with existing family orders. But what we're also seeing is an increase in the end of relationships and an increase in applications for divorce. And the estimates are indicating that that increase is somewhere around 30 to 40% in terms of urgent applications, which is just astronomical.
Absolutely.
Unfortunately, the family courts have acted quite quickly, and they have recently, on Wednesday of last week, which puts us at the 29th, I think, of April, don't hold me to that, but they launched 2 new lists that deal, we're calling it the COVID-19 list. And so there's 2 national lists which will be run essentially by electronic applications, as are most applications still being run.
Right.
And that gives a pathway for parties to be able to list a matter if it's the case that they've experienced some family violence. They may have, for example, separated whilst they've been in these lockdown arrangements, but because of the lockdown arrangements, they've not been able to move on or move out. They might still be living under the same roof while separated.
Right.
And unfortunately, in some circumstances, that's following an incident of family violence. So I think what is clear from these very sad statistics is that it's really obvious that this lockdown measures and the COVID-19 virus has had a very real impact on relationships and on families alike, particularly in the case of families that have got children involved or a separation where children are involved. A separation can have really, really long-standing and drastic effects, not only for the parties to the relationship, but also for their children. And I suppose, and perhaps we can talk about this later, but the way in which parties separate if a relationship can't be saved is also quite important to ensuring that the parties are able to maintain some form of relationship, because the reality is that even if parties separate, they've still got these, if they've got children, they've still got these children together, and they will have to navigate parenting arrangements. So separating well is a phrase which I think I've heard you use before, is very, very important in my view.
That's right.
I suppose I'm going to throw the floor over to you, and I suppose the question that I have for you and that parties or people who are in relationships might benefit from is some information about how they can avoid becoming one of these statistics. I mean, we are living in an environment where all of a sudden we're spending a lot more time with our partners, and I'm hearing from clients reports of, all of a sudden I noticed that he breathes heavy. All of a sudden I noticed that she chews loudly. I mean, I suppose it's easy to get distracted by these traits and focus on some negative things. So if I had to ask you, what is your top 5 tips about how to avoid becoming one of these statistics and how one might be able to save their relationship, as it were, or how one can invest in their relationship. What would you say to people?
It's a great question. It's a great question. And you're absolutely right, Justin. We're living in unprecedented times where there's a lot of crushing pressure on us individually and as families of these intense, endless amount of hours together. And anything that used to bother us in a diluted form feels very, very intense at the moment. What I would love to just take a bit of time to outline is just a couple of things, 5 things actually, to consider before you pursue the separation path. Because what I find is that when I work with couples, sometimes these 5 things, or 1 or 2 of them, have actually been overlooked, and they really can save the relationship if it is salvageable. So I'll run through them quickly. What I'd like to just point out as a caveat is that these principles don't apply if there's domestic violence, family violence. This is for a safe situation. And so obviously if there's family or domestic violence, then safety needs to become the first priority. But assuming that that isn't happening in this scenario, I'd love to just run through some ideas. The other thing I should say up front is if you've tried these ideas as a couple and they haven't yet worked, it really does make sense to outsource to expert help if things have become too intense, too toxic, too sore, too inflammatory, and you can't have these conversations together. Having a third party there as a counselor, psychologist, mediator in that role can actually get the job done. But these are the 5 things I would love you to consider if you're listening to this today. And the first one is there some sort of block in the way of the relationship that really needs to be attended to in order for the relationship to progress? So in other words, if there's been a breach of trust and that hasn't yet been addressed, processed, from both parties' perspective, the relationship really can't move forward in health, because in order for you to lean into a relationship and actually be fully present, you need to extend trust. And if the trust has been broken, that needs to be restored. Aspects to that would include, for instance, do you have some forgiveness to do? Are you still holding offense? Because you can't move forward in relationship until you've forgiven, which means sometimes you've got to face really painful things and unpack and process them. If there's been a breach of trust or there's a roadblock in the relationship, that really does affect both parties' thoughts, their feelings, and their behaviors. And obviously that's needs to be dealt with. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that, again, just in line with certain principles that apply to any relationship, when you apply these principles, it's a bit like gravity. What goes up must come down. And if you apply these principles to any relationship and it's salvageable, you will get a return on your investment. So the second thing I'd love you to check in on is, have you actually prioritized this relationship and given it the right amount of time and attention? Because it's so easy in a busy world, especially when we're feeling a little bit frustrated, to not attend to our relationships and nurture them. So I'm seeing that a lot more with COVID, that people are just frustrating and retreating or avoiding rather than doing the work of building and nurturing that relationship, which every single relationship needs. And what I say to couples that I work with is, you need to have time daily and then a separate, more formal meeting once a week. And the daily time would be no more than 10 minutes is needed. Everybody can find 10 minutes. And that would be without kids, without TV, without IT, without phones or devices, where you're literally just exchanging those 10 minutes to check in on each other. How was your day? With genuine interest and without distraction. That goes a long way to building mileage in the connectedness of your relationship. And then once a week, I call it the State of the Nation, where you just exchange the highlights of what's going well and what's not going well, and at a ratio of 2 to 1. So if you've got something difficult to say or something that's making you unhappy, make sure you're bringing 2 positives. What I like to say is something that you're grateful for that the other person is doing, and something about who they are. So I'm grateful that you are always so reliable with taking the bins out on a Tuesday night. And I'm also grateful that you're really a good dad. I love watching the kids play football with you on the field this week. That actually reaches us as human beings. That's what makes us thrive, and it's what makes us open to relationship. And if it's been a long time since you've done that, there would be no surprise that you find your relationship in troubled waters. So time and attention, intentional setting aside of time and attention. That's the second thing. The third principle is just building credit into a relationship. And again, we know from research, we know from even anecdotally, people would relate to this. When you build into a relationship, and there's 5 easy ways to do that, which I'll share with you, but when you put that credit in and you invest that time and that intentional focus, you will definitely reap the rewards of warmth and connection. That's just how we're wired as humans. If someone is interested in us and leans into who we are, we respond with openness and warmth. And sometimes I think what we forget is when we first meet our partners, that's so easy. No one has to ask us to do that. We just do it. And then over time, as life pressures come along and kids come along and jobs change, we really have to do that with much more intention. And it's got to be something that you work on. But for those of you familiar with the love languages, there's 5 ways that we can be reached. So there's no shortage of suggestions. We can be reached through words, encouraging words, physical touch. So just making sure that you're hugging your partner, or, you know, any kind of physical touch. Time. When was the last time you just gave them a bit of your time when they just wanted to chat about their day or share something with you? Gifts. If you know your partner loves a vanilla slice, come home with a vanilla slice. It makes them feel seen. It makes them feel appreciated. Those little things. You know, one of the things I've learned in this career is that we rise and fall on these tiny examples. She always burns my toast and doesn't care. She knows I hate burnt toast. These things actually matter. They make us feel seen or unseen. Acts of service, you know, fill your partner's car with petrol next time you're out. Those things actually matter. That's what helps us to rise and fall. So I think number 3 is just building credit into that relationship intentionally. The 4th principle is communication. So we can do communication really poorly, or we can do it really well. And learning good communication skills is not difficult. So one of the things I always work with people and say is, your partner can't read your mind, and you need to accept that. I talk to so many people who are stuck in offense or pain or feel neglected or overlooked because they feel like their partner should somehow get it, but they haven't communicated that to them. And, you know, when you've spent a few decades with somebody, or even a few years, or even a few months, we are evolving people. We have an action tendency towards growth. So we're always changing. Even our values might shift. So if you're not communicating that to them, people really won't know what's happening in your mind. So it's your responsibility to identify, own without shame, and express your thoughts, your feelings, your behavior. And from that space, you can have an expectation of your partner to respond. But if you haven't done that, you know, then you haven't done that. So communication and doing it well. And then the 5th thing, or the principle to just check on, the 5th thing is, have you been honest and come at this with a vulnerable spirit of humility and honesty, and looking at, is this something that you are going through as an individual, rather than in the context of that dyad of a long-term or you know, a relationship or your family. And the reason I say that, Justin, is that I speak to many people in this clinic who are going through something personally, some sort of transition, maybe some sort of crisis, and they feel like they've fallen out of love with their partner, or they feel disconnected from their families. And what's actually happening is they've disconnected from their core self because they're going through something. And after we've worked together for 3 to 6 months, sometimes up to a year, if that's what it takes, that person can come out the other side and go, all right, I'm reconnected with myself. I've navigated that chapter. I actually can't believe I left my family behind. Why did I do that? I still love my partner. And if it's been 3 to 6 months, you might be fortunate enough that your family's still there waiting for you, or your partner hasn't moved on. But if you've done the work slowly and it's been a year, the saddest thing I suppose I see is that sometimes that partner is actually still not there for you. So the 5th thing I would ask people to consider is just take ownership, make sure that this isn't something you're actually going through as an individual, that you've generalized onto the relationship. So I hope those make sense to you.
Look, and there's a couple of things I can probably relate to. I mean, my wife in my own marriage has told me a number of times that she can't read my mind, so I might have to pay some attention to number 4 and work on my own communication. But I think all those points, I think they're interesting, because we live in an age where I think we think that we as individuals are great communicators, but yet we still have to work on communication day to day, whether it's in a private or professional life. Communication is very, very important. And I think we can always do better at that. And some of the other things that you touched on is building credit, I think you called it, so something you can do in 3. It's curious that, you know, investing 10 minutes in circumstances where we would seem to have plenty of time with our respective partners in this scenario, but we still have to remind ourselves that with all of that time that we have with them, we need to invest it But if I understand what you're saying, and perhaps you can provide a little bit further guidance, it's the type of time that you're spending. It's easy to fall, and I do it myself. It's easy to sit on a lounge on your phone and try and forget about the stress of the day. But if your partner's sitting there and you've ignored them so that you get that alone time, particularly if you haven't communicated that you need that alone time, is that the sort of scenario that you see increasing with this COVID-19 virus, with people being locked down in their homes?
Yes, I think we've become very unintentional about our time. We're wasting a lot of time. We're distracting ourselves. Time is such a precious gift, and we have actually been gifted with time through this awful crisis. But if you want to make sure that that opportunity doesn't slip through your fingers, because being intentional with your time is very different to just treading through time. And I think you've hit the nail on the head there, that 10 minutes you would think is easy to find, but you've actually got to be pretty intentional to set aside 10 minutes of focused attention with somebody. And if their love language isn't, say, specifically time, then you need to set aside your 10 minutes in maybe whipping up dinner that that your partner loves, because their love language might be acts of service, but it needs to be intentional.